Well, my name is Kip Zeider. For those who may not know, I'm the Visitor Services Outreach Coordinator for the International Motor Racing Research Center. And I want to welcome you all here. Thank you for taking a little time out of your afternoon to come visit us as we talk about open wheel madness. I am obligated to give you the PBS opening here, tell you just a little bit about the center. The center last year celebrated its 20th anniversary as one of the world's foremost archival institutions dedicated to collecting, preserving, and sharing the history of motorsports. The center is a 501c3 corporation, so we are kept alive and able to do our work through membership. If you are not a current member, we would very much like you to become a member. You can become a member for as low as $25. If you are a current member but have not renewed your 2019 membership, we urge you to consider doing that. We do have membership cards over in the center on one of the low tables. The center conversations are free and open to the public, obviously, but we are going to feed you, and we're going to feed you quite nicely, actually, after this is over. Our administrative person and caterer extraordinaire, Samantha Baker, is doing a taco bar today. So if you're happy with the conversation, if you would like to contribute just a little bit, we have a little collection jar right at knee level, actually. If you miss it, you're going to bang your knee on it. So if you wouldn't mind dropping something into the collection plate, that would be very helpful as well. Before we get going, I have several people I need to thank on this. First of all and foremost of all are our two speakers, Mr. Herb Anastor and Stephen Bubb. When we were considering putting this program together, I emailed Lenny Salmons from Area Auto Racing News and asked him what we were projecting to do and who might I get that would be experts in their field. And Mr. Salmons immediately suggested Herb and Steve. I emailed them, and we are very happy and very honored to have them here today. I am personally fascinated at both of the things they're going to talk about. Herb is talking about board track racing, which I've been fascinated about for a number of years. And Stephen's going to talk about sprint car and open wheel racing in the 20s and 30s, and some guy named Al Capone and what he had to do with racing. And that was the hook that got me psyched on his talk as well. So I certainly want to thank both Herb and Stephen for coming here. I also want to thank Alan Tadich. Alan, are you in the audience? And if so, would you stand up, please? Mr. Tadich comes from Endicott, New York, and Mr. Tadich is responsible for the three cool cars that we have on the floor there. And I want to thank you very much, Alan, for your willingness to bring them up. And Alan will be standing by should you have questions on any of those cars after the program is over, okay? I want to thank Lenny Salmons again. Actually, right next to our little collection jar, if you will, are copies of this week's edition of Area Auto Racing News, one of the last remaining weekly publications in racing, and my hat is off to Mr. Salmons for keeping this going. This is, I think the paper started, well, guys, you know better than me, what, 63? Something like that? We've all seen a number of racing papers come and go over the years, but Mr. Salmons does a great job with Area Auto. So he was nice enough to send several copies of this week's edition up. They're free, they're on the table. Grab one, take it home, read it, and consider taking out a subscription to AARN. Because if you are any kind of short track race fan at all, this is the paper you need to get every week. I also want to thank Chuck Franzese. He was not able to be here today, but if you notice the real cool little Indy Roadster models that we had in some of the display cases, those are Chuck's, so I want to thank Chuck for that. And I certainly want to thank our staff. Programs like this don't get done with just any one of me standing up here. I want to thank Jenny and Duke for finding all the cool stuff that we have on display, the programs, the photos. I want to thank Josh for helping both Herb and Stephen kind of format their presentation into the program you're going to see here. The aforementioned Samantha Baker, who is caterer extraordinary. You'll enjoy that later. Mr. Green, our historian. Joe Calley, our SCCA archivist. Joe had a radio program that we got on. And Bill, of course, just lends his expertise to anything that we're doing at the center. So I want to thank the staff of the center, definitely. Okay, just a couple upcoming events that I need to talk about. While you're all going to enjoy this presentation, the next one up, and it's 2 weeks from today, is going to be our 6th annual model car show. We're very excited this year because the Rochester Lego user group is going to be coming down and joining us for the day. Now they have put together, or they're going to be putting together 1/8 scale race cars. Sam's got them on the flyer there. You can see them in the diagonal line that they'll have on display here. They've also put together a really cool little sports car, like a early Daytona prototype sports car, that they'll be selling in kit form for $6, which we think will be a pretty cool souvenir of the event. We have, at last count, I believe, 15 different modelers who will be displaying their wares. And for those of you who collect models, or those of you who know anybody that collects models, you know, and for example, these guys are really happy to talk about their collection. So we invite you to come and look at the models. We invite you to, if you have kids or grandkids, this kind of audience would be your grandkids for the most part, bring your grandkids, because they're going to love the Legos. We're going to set the Lego people up in our film room. They're bringing the kit car, they're bringing the 1/8 scale cars, and they're bringing a Pinewood Derby style track that people can race their cars on. So that's really going to be fun for kids of all ages. Also, on April 6th is the worldwide unveiling of the IMRRC's raffle car for this year. Can't tell you what it is yet. You have to come see it on April 6th. It's actually going to be at the track. That's also opening weekend at WGI. So we'll have the car up there on both Saturday the 6th and Sunday the 7th. It's very cool. You're going to want to get a ticket, or 3, or 10, or whatever. But that gets unveiled on April 6th. Our next event is our 3rd annual New York City bus trip to the International Automobile Show on April 24th. This is always a great day. The cool thing about going to a car show every year is it's different every year, as opposed to going to a museum where you see the same things most every year. I am in need of more people to actually be able to run the trip. And the thing is, I have to order my tickets by this coming Friday, or then people have to buy them at the show, and that's just a pain queuing up in the line. So if you have any interest at all, if you could give me a call sometime in the coming week, that would be great. We probably still need a good 15 or 20 people. We'd love to have you go. Even if you don't want to go to the car show, let me know that. We'll just minus your ticket cost out of it. You can take the bus to New York and hang out in the city for the day. So it's either a bus ride to New York with a car show thrown in, or just a bus ride to New York and you can hang out in New York for the day. But I do need to know in the coming week. On May 18th is our next center conversation, Racing Through the Trees, an inside look at pro rallying. This is a program that was actually been spearheaded by one of our fellows on our board, Mr. Bob Henderson, who was a rallier years ago. And it is going to be a true inside look at rallying. We're going to have drivers, navigators, course workers, and course organizers that will be part of kind of a panel discussion on the sport. We've always wanted to do this. We've never just been able to work it into our schedule, but we're very excited about that. Hopefully we'll have a rally car or two on the floor. We're going to do a special shout out to our friends at the Susquehanna Trails Rally, which is right down the road in Wellsboro. So that should be another interesting conversation, and that's set for May 18th. And then we're very excited about this, the 6th annual IMRRC Award Dinner. This year we're honoring Bobby Rahal. Bobby is a past president of our governing council. Mr. Rahal is a wonderful, super guy, former Indy 500 winner, multi-time kart, well, I don't know if it was kart or IndyCar or what they were calling it at the time that he won the championships, but multi-time champion, probably one of the most versatile drivers ever to compete in this era. Ran Formula One here at the Glen, SCCA, IndyCar, a little bit of NASCAR, obviously owns IndyCar teams now, IMSA teams, terrific guy. If you'd like to come for a truly spectacular evening, it's a wonderful evening. So if you have any interest in that, call any of us here at the center. We can give you more information on that. But that's on Thursday, June 27th. Other than that, there's always stuff going on here. We'll have the raffle car at the track for all of the major events, the IMSA 6 hours, the Cup race, the SVRA in September, and whatever they're calling what was last year, Pirelli World Challenge, whatever they're calling it this year. So the car will be up there. Otherwise, the car may be on the road going to some shows, and if it's not, it'll be sitting in front of the center. So come down, take a look at it, hopefully buy a raffle ticket or two. For further information on what's going on at the center, just always look at our website. That's the best thing. So I'm going to get out of here right now. My time is done. But again, I want to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank Herb and Stephen. Herb, I'm going to invite you up now. I'm happy for those of you who are basketball fans, as I am, admittedly. I'm happy you've taken a break from March Madness and are going to join us for Open Wheel Madness. So settle back and relax, and Herb, come on up.
Kip, thank you. Gee, a nice crowd. And first thing I'd like to do is thank everyone involved with this for asking us. My wife Terry and I have enjoyed our time so far here in Watkins Glen, and it's an honor to be here because I know the people who've been before me and the people who are involved in this organization, and it's something I never really would have ever expected. So thank you all for coming. I hope we have some fun this afternoon. This is something that I'm interested in. Kip has asked me to talk a little bit about myself. We live in Vineland, New Jersey. I was a school teacher for 25 years, taught health and physical education, and for much of that time while I was doing that, I was also working at the local newspaper in Vineland. I was a sports writer, and the last 2 years I was a daily columnist. Which means I went into the office every night and I sat and looked at that screen for 2 or 3 hours before I wrote anything which had to be printed the next day. So that was always a lot of fun. As far as automobile racing goes, I got involved as a kid going to the Vineland Speedway, which was in our community. It started out as a dirt track, then it became asphalt track. My family wasn't really racing fans. Before I was old enough to drive, my dad would take me to the races because he knew I liked to race, liked the racing. And then when I got old enough to drive, I was a drag racer, became an official at the track, was a starter with flags. I'm that old. Our track closed. My racing got involved with more with what you could see on TV, reading National Speed Sport News, articles like that. I got involved with Lenny. I've been writing for about 40 years, Area Auto Racing News. I was also a contributing editor for 20 years with Stock Car Racing and Open Wheel magazines. I worked for Jimmy Horton when he was doing his modified racing. He still is. I was 11 years. I worked on that crew, did tires, crew setup, car involvement and things like that. A few times with Jimmy. And I'm really interested in the history of automobile racing. It's just so interesting to find out how we got to where we are. This board track racing is part of that. Before I go into what I'm going to speak about today, which is really more of an overview, I think, because there's so much you can talk about in all this, I want to point out this painting. This was done by Joe Henning, and he's a motorsports illustrator. And the man in the white car is Frank Lockhart, and that's a rear-wheel drive Miller. And the man in the front-wheel drive Miller is Peter DiPaolo. And when I asked the people who had this painting if I could use it, they had no question about it. They thought this would be a terrific idea, and that's why I left the logo, which you can see, is the American Hot Rod Foundation. American Hot Rod Foundation is an organization much like this. They deal with old-time auto racing and the history of the sport. They deal with board tracks a little bit, mostly with hot rodding. And it's not a bad idea if you're interested one time and you're sitting at your computer to just type in American Hot Rod Foundation and see what they have to offer. I think you're here today because you enjoy this kind of thing, and that's a nice activity to get involved with. Board track racing started in Europe as bicycle racing. It was easy to build tracks out of wood, and velodrome is a French term meaning bicycle racetrack. And this is what became very popular in Europe, people racing bicycles on these oval board tracks. Eventually came over to this country, and there were velodromes throughout. Bicycle racing was very popular at the end of the 1890s and early 1900s. Many of the early automobile racers were bicycle racers. The Wright brothers were bicycle racers. So there was bicycle in the competition, not only on road racing as they did, but also on tracks. And this is how the velodrome became popular in this country. So if we're going to race bicycles on a wooden track, well, motorcycles aren't that much bigger, so let's try them. And they did that too. Those people really did things that were just unimaginable. Motorcycles on velodromes were raced with the throttle wired full force. So they're going around full force with no brakes. A lot of accidents, a lot of people were killed, but this is what they did, and people continued to do that. Someone thought, well, if we have bicycles and motorcycles, maybe we could have automobiles on a wooden track. So they did that, and the first track that was ever built for automobile racing with a wooden base was the Playa del Rey in Venice, California. It was a 1-mile track, 1910. And let's just go to that. This is the track. This is a painting of it, and it was in Los Angeles. And it was designed by Fred Moskowitz, who was eventually involved with the automobile company, and built by Jack Prince. Jack Prince was a bicycle champion, and he came to this country to build these racetracks for motorcycles and bicycles. And Moskowitz and Prince put this track together. This was a 1-mile track, banked 30 degrees, and Moskowitz was really excited about this, but Howard Marmon, who had the Marmon Automobile Company, said, you know, this is okay, but these guys aren't going to do that good. And Moskowitz said $5,000 bet that they would go over 100 miles an hour. Now, $5,000, as we see, was about $133,000 today, so this wasn't a small wager, and he lost that bet by less than 1 mile an hour. The car that went the fastest at that time was Barney Oldfield, and it was 9.7 miles an hour around the track. So for just that little bit, he lost that money. But this was the first track, and I'm going to go back to show the listing of the American board tracks. There were 24 of them from 1910 through 1931. The second track was built in Oakland. This is where Jack Prince's headquarters was, and it was in 1911. It was a half-mile track. You can see there were also 3 other half-mile tracks that were built late in the 1920s. These tracks were wonderful board tracks for the racers, but they never had a AAA national championship race. That was always on a track that was a mile or longer. These 4 other tracks in Oakland, Akron, Bridgeport, and Woodbridge were more like a local weekly track. They had regular races. Sometimes they had special events. Sometimes they were run monthly, depending on the popularity of the races. And they were more of a local flavor other than the rest of the tracks, which we'll see, which were all national championship tracks. You see, from 1910, it took until 1915 for the next track to be built. That was in Chicago. It was a 2-mile track. Tacoma was a 2-mile track, and Omaha, and then Des Moines. So you had 4 tracks within 1 year that developed into something that became a national championship circuit. All of these tracks were run for a variety of years with a variety of winners, and the history of these tracks, all these tracks, we could spend hours on. What I have done is after we get done here, I have a folder which is a more complete evaluation and stories on all these tracks, which you're certainly welcome to look at, and I think you'll enjoy seeing what we have there. But we want to talk a little bit more about the overall nature of board track racing, and in doing that, here is what the coverage was in the newspapers of the first board track races. Now at Playa del Rey, this was a week-long activity, and they had a wide variety of things that took place. Notice the headlines. They were running this mile track in about 30 seconds. So it's about pretty good. 38 seconds, I think, was the time. But notice the cars that were being raced. These cars were basically the cars that were being produced by the manufacturers, and they were just stripped down. They had wooden wheels. The tires sometimes were solid tires. They weren't all necessarily rubber tires. But look at the coverage that was given to what was taking place. Here's a Marmon here in the, or Marmon rather, up here in the top corner. That was driven by Ray Haroon. You can see the other vehicles in there, how heavy they are. Imagine going 90, 95 miles an hour in something like that, and this is what these folks were doing. Notice the Michelin tire ad. Michelin was a great supporter of automobile racing. In fact, it was one of the leading automobile racing tires at the time. The Fiat ad on the side here is talking about Ralph De Palma and Caleb Bragg. They were two of the drivers that were Fiat racers. And what they talked about when the Fiat and the power of the race car. And then the records that were being set. This first week of racing board track in California had a variety of things. There were record runs going on. There were races of maybe 5 laps going on. There were challenge races. They had a wide variety of engine sizes so that someone would race. We're going to try and set a record for a 100 cubic inch engine. We're going to try and set a record for an engine that's 300 cubic inches, things like that. And this went on for that week. Here again, 1910, the Playa del Rey. Notice the people standing outside the track. Notice that the track wall is perpendicular to the ground, not perpendicular to the racetrack. In the early tracks, this caused a lot of problems. Cars would go into that and just go over the top. They wouldn't necessarily come back in. But you see how these cars were? There were 2-man cars. There were 1-man cars. Notice the gas tanks. Just regular gas tank that was in the automobile before they stripped the body panels away. Here again, here is more coverage. This is Ray Haroon driving his Marmon. He won a 100-mile race. The old Los Angeles Herald, this was a front page story. This was April 10th. It was in early April when the track opened. In June 1910, here was an article by the New York Times comparing the board track in California with the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, which had only been open since 1909. How the comparison of the two, what could be done to the automobile industry, because automobile racing at that time was really a development of the automobile industry. This is how people tested their cars. There was no test track as you would say. They were racing on like this. They were racing on fairgrounds. They were racing point to point from city to city, or a city would lay out a course and they would race around that. And there was questions about the board tracks getting bigger and more popular and things like that. New York Times at the time was the newspaper of record. Here's another photograph which I think you might find interesting. Here is the Beverly Hills racetrack. This was 1920 to 1924. Notice what it looked like when it was in operation. That's Santa Monica Boulevard and Wilshire Boulevard. The color photograph below is Santa Monica Boulevard and Wilshire Boulevard. Where the big red dot is the approximate location of the racetrack. The racetrack actually came back beyond where the red roof houses are. You can see the size of this. This was a 2-mile track. This was in 1920, and this was the first track that used the Searles spiral easement curve. This is a special that actually was used by railroads to make it easier for trains to go around the curve. What this effectively was, let's say you had a curve on your track on the first turn was 1,500 feet around. Let's just use that for numbers. Searle easement curve would every 500 feet, it would shorten for a little bit the radius on that curve, so it would be easier to turn the car through the turn. Then when you got through it, it would go the other way. Art Pillsbury used this with Jack Prince. This is when they first became partners, and Art Pillsbury believed this was going to be the easiest way for the cars to go around these tracks at the high speeds that they were going. And he also said an ideal board racing track would allow a car to go around without turning the wheel at all. When we drive on the highway, you're going around the curve, you're going to turn the wheel a little bit. This way, you would just hold your hand steady and the car would go around. What made it so possible for these cars to go very, very fast for their time. Imagine now how many people realized that where they once lived was a racetrack. I don't think many people would realize that. And I say this is a very modern, this is a 2019 picture of Santa Monica and Wilshire Boulevard. Board tracks were easy to construct because really all it was framing a house effectively. You had long 18, 20 foot, sometimes longer pieces of wood that were put down on a frame, and in other photographs you'll see the outside of how it looked. And you just needed a lot of men with a lot of nails and a lot of hammers. The Atlantic City Motor Speedway was 1.5 miles. They built it in 3 months, start to finish, with 700 men, and all they did was just pound nails all the time. And they built this track, and the tracks approximately on the straightaway were anywhere from 40 to 60 feet wide. Turns were 70, 75 feet wide. So they were big pieces. They used millions of board feet, tons of nails, and they used whatever they could to bring them in, the product into the area where it was being built, from heavy trucks to horse-drawn wagons, because remember, this was the early part of the 20th century. And you see the steep nature of the board track. This is a turn, and it looks much like someone when they're going up the roof of a house sometimes. And for cost-wise, as we'll get into later, they were only hundreds of dollars in that. That was cheap to millions of dollars today. So it was really pretty effective, and they went up rather quickly when they were built. The only problem with wood out in the weather is unless you do something to preserve it, you're going to have some problems, and there were no tracks effectively that used any kind of wood preservative. Most of the wood was pine wood like you'd use in house construction. Some tried harder woods, but that didn't necessarily work either. And you can see the damage to this board track and what would happen during the races when something broke, which did. They would fix it from underneath. Peter DePaolo one time said the most interesting thing he experienced as a board track racer was the head of someone popping up in the hole to see where he had to fix the track. This is a picture of the Laurel Speedway, which was also known as the Baltimore-Washington Speedway. This is opening day, July 11th, 1925. I found this picture. I really thought it was a good one as it gave a look. You can see in the far corner the banking and how that looks, and the massive size on 100 acres of ground these tracks were. But the thing that impressed me most about this picture, and maybe you've picked it out yourself, look at all the straw hats. And there were not very many women that were in the grandstand and wherever area this was taken. But this is, again, this was one of the more popular tracks, and as I pointed out here, you went to the races to see things, but you also saw things besides racing cars. They had airplane demonstrations, frequently airplane demonstrations, because in the early and the late teens, it was a new item. They had balloon races, daytime fireworks, bands that were there. When my father was a little boy, he and my uncle and my grandmother and grandfather went to the track in the Atlantic City Motor Speedway in New Jersey, about 20 miles from where we live. And my dad said that he remembered all the people that were there. There were 85,000 or so at the time he went, and all the cars, because people came by car. There were no transportation other than cars. And they had an interesting race besides the automobile race. They had what they called an ambulance race. They had half a dozen race car drivers, a half a dozen ambulances, a half a dozen doctors, and a half a dozen orderlies. So each ambulance had 3 people. And on the backstretch of the Atlantic City Motor Speedway, they had 6 dummies that were supposed to be injured people or someone who needed medical care. And the idea of the race was to see who could get to the dummy first and get back to the starting line, and that was going to be the winner. They also had stock car races at these, and we'll talk about this later, and so on. It was interesting. My father said, because he became a doctor, that was something he remembered from the race other than all the excitement of that. But this is just a general good look at an opening day at a board track speedway. Notice all the people in the infield. Notice all the people in the grandstand. Ticket prices were $1 up to $10, $12, something like that, which again we're talking about at times in the 20s, and so you could say $1 in 19, and as I point out, $1 in the 20s is worth about $15 today. So it was a good chunk of your money, but the people had a good time, and the board tracks attracted a lot of attention. Here again is the board track in at Baltimore, Washington. Notice the extreme banking of the speedway, the cars, millers in the front. Here again, down on the lower picture, going into the first turn. The fields of these races had anywhere 15, maybe 20 at the tops for the top number in the entry. But you can see on the outside of this lower picture what some of the support structure was. All wood. The only track that wasn't, there were 2 tracks that didn't have a wood base. One was the Sheep's Head Bay in Brooklyn. That was a metal base. And the other was the Tacoma track, which was actually built in the ground, and we'll see that in just a little bit. This was a 1.25 mile track, and because of the nature of board track racing, speed was the thing that was involved, and pit stops, and so those weren't really expected. If you had a pit stop, you were going to be not going to race for first place. This was a 45-degree banking in this track, and that's generally what the banking was in these bigger tracks. Here is the Tacoma track, and what's interesting about this track, as I said, is this track was built in the ground. You can see in the picture on the right here, the banking, you can see the dirt. They put the boards in the ground, and then they filled it with asphalt and gravel. Notice the 2 race cars on the bottom here. You can barely pick it out, but they have a screen in front of their radiator because the asphalt and gravel didn't do anything but come up and bang into the cars. In fact, there were frequent tire explosions. The drivers were injured. Notice they're 2-man cars. Tacoma, to compensate for this, placed high winning prizes, so they would get all the top drivers. But of all the tracks that were national championship tracks, this was the one that was the most disliked by the racers. In fact, one of the comments was at the time, board track racing is really not that much fun because the tracks are not good, and then there's Tacoma. The other thing that's interesting about the Tacoma track is notice that it's not a round track or it's not an oval track. It was built on the land that was available, much like the Darlington Speedway has the two different curves. But the other thing that's interesting about this track, it's one of the very few that is even recognized today as having been there. There's a historical marker in the center of the picture that shows where the Tacoma track was. What is located where Tacoma is now is a community college, part of that. These are the people who I would say are probably the most famous people to come out of the board track era. Jack Prince over on the left, you can see he was a big, heavy man, a strong man. Most of the bicycles were big, rugged guys because of the race on big bicycles. They weren't the 3-pound machines that are available now. Jack Prince was from 1910 to 1927 involved in just about all the tracks, although when Art Pillsbury joined him in 1920, the whole nature of the board track development changed just because of that spiral easement curve. The interesting thing also about Art Pillsbury, after he designed all these board tracks, he also became a top-ranked official in the American Automobile Association's racing situation. He was the West Coast supervisor for a long time, and he had important roles at the Indianapolis 500, things like that. The bottom four people are four men who did a lot for board track racing, especially in the second part in the 20s, because most of the cars were Millers or Duesenbergs. Harry Miller, of course, was a famous person before he even got involved in racing because he manufactured carburetors. If we want to look over here here's an ad for a Miller carburetor. Dario Resta, Johnny Ayton, and Eddie Rickenbacker all used the Miller carburetor, and that was a popular carburetor used by lots of people in lots of different things, not only in automobile racing, but in just to make your car better. One of the things that was interesting in the research of this era, there were a lot of aftermarket companies that were making things to make the automobile that the people were driving daily a better automobile. And we'll talk about that a little more in itself. Lower picture shows Harry Miller with one of his Miller engines. They were straight 8. He was involved with the Puccio Grand Prix car before he got involved in racing on a full-time scale. The maintenance of that car and the Puccio had a lot to do with the development of the Miller engines and also the Offenhauser engine, which you see on the right here. Interesting thing about Harry Miller is his shop foreman was Fred H. Offenhauser, who became the man who developed the Offenhauser racing engine. There's also another Fred Offenhauser, Fred C. Fred C. was Fred H.'s nephew. And they worked together, but they didn't like each other very much. And they had problems working together, but they did, and Fred C. was a pretty decent machinist, so Fred H. kept him around. Fred C. went to the Navy in World War II, and after he got out of the Navy, he thought, well, I don't want to go work for my uncle again. I'm going to start my own business. He's the man that developed the Offenhauser speed equipment, the stuff you see, the valve covers, the intake manifolds, this, that, and the other. And Fred H. was in the Offenhauser racing engines. Offenhauser. They had problems with the name. One thought the other shouldn't be using the name. So they sued, each one sued the other. Took this to court, and they sued because they wanted the exclusive right to use the name Offenhauser. Well, the judge, I guess this must have been a fun time too, having two people yell about the same thing. The judge decided that they could both use the name Offenhauser because it was their name. However, legally, the judge ruled that the only thing that could be called an Offie is the four-cylinder racing engine. So if you hear, I got Offie head covers, actually they're Offenhauser head covers. They can't use the name. The other thing about the Offie engine is that Leo Goosen, from the time he began working with Harry Miller right up until his death, and he passed away in 1974, he did a great deal with automobile racing engines. He was the one when George Sally decided he wanted to have the lay-down engine in his 1957 Indianapolis car. He's the one that redesigned that so the oil would flow properly because it was 18 degrees from being flat. And so he was really an outstanding gentleman. And Fred and Harry Miller thought enough of Leo Goosen to tell him in 1925, "You've done outstanding work for my company. I appreciate everything you do. This year, I'm going to pay you $1 an hour." That was a high rate for him. And at that time, that was about $15 an hour in today's money. So those are people. And of course, the Duesenbergs are interesting because they were in automobile racing actually to sell automobiles. They made their racing cars because the Duesenbergs were sold to people only as rolling chassis. If you wanted a Duesenberg, you would buy the Duesenberg rolling chassis, then take it to a body man, and he would make the body for you. Here's an example at the top left of Eddie Hearn, who was a Duesenberg racer. And if you can see the ad, it tells about the engine, how powerful it is, because they're selling the engine, they're selling the frame. The Duesenberg Model J, the lower part, talks about the frame and the engine. And you would buy that Duesenbergs for $8,500, then take it to a coach builder who would complete your car. In the time that the Model J Duesenberg was being sold, $8,500 was about $125,000 in today's money. That's just for the chassis, tires, wheels, running gear. Then you take it to the body coach builder, and he would charge you at least that much or even more. It's possible that these cars together were worth $250,000 in the late 1920s. There you see the Duesenberg Model A chassis. That's what the ads were all talking about. The top picture there is of Peter DePaulo's 1925 Indianapolis 500 winner. That was a Duesenberg, and the difference between Duesenberg Racing and Duesenberg Motors is they were both separate. They were not doing the other. And it was like that the entire time. All the Duesenberg engines were built by the Lycoming, or fashioned by the Lycoming machine. In fact, they were designed by the Duesenbergs, but they didn't have an engine manufacturing situation like Miller did. And I mentioned E.L. Cord in the back, on the end of that sentence there. E.L. Cord bought the Duesenberg company in the late 1920s, and he developed the Duesenberg as part of the companies that he owned. And there's that straight 8 Duesenberg logo, which was very famous at the time. This is maybe the most interesting car that ever raced on a board track. See, Hal Scott Aviation Motors. This was a man who developed aviation engines, but he did it in race cars, not in airplanes. And you see it looks really like a giant go-kart. And he raced it at least one time, I've been able to find, in April 1912 on the half-mile Oakland track. So it was just was just an unusual thing, but it was also a very fast car. It was one of the first to ever go 60 miles an hour, which at the time was really going something. And it was just the kind of things during the early years of board track racing that you would see. These next few pictures are just to give you an idea of some of the cars that are raced. Caleb Bragg is the man who beat Barney Ofield in that first race at Playa del Rey, but he was considered a novice driver because he wasn't professional in his racing. He was a novice, and he actually took the place of Ralph De Palma, who was supposed to race against Oldfield, but there was something wrong with Oldfield's Fiat, or with De Palma's Fiat, so he substituted and he beat the famous Barney Oldfield. Barney, of course, was a bicycle racer before he became an automobile racer. Also notice that these were both chain drive automobiles. Chain drive. And that Blitzen Benz, that was the world speed record holder at the time. Now we're going a little later. This is 1916, a Delage from France. There's a Hudson. These, again, were cars that were stripped down, racing bodies put on, and they used them as race cars and used them to test the vehicles that were being built by Hudson and Delage. Here's a Stutz Bearcat and an early Duesenberg. These were, imagine, I say, going 100 miles an hour and something like that. With no safety belts, nothing safety-wise at all except what was built into the race car. And these are different people. These are different people. Another thing that was interesting doing research on board track racing was the artwork and how the things were designed, the race programs. And so this is a 1915 souvenir program at Sheepshead Bay. Just a beautiful painting. Look at some of the cars in the pictures below. These were all, again, these were standard automobiles that had been converted. They were all two-man cars with a variety of engines. And again, note the guardrail perpendicular to the ground, not perpendicular to the race course. Now we're getting into some of the more famous names. This is Louis Chevrolet. This is a red Buick Bug. And we forget a lot about people back then that there were colors for these cars, and this was a beautiful red car. Buick's the oldest active name in the American automobile industry, and this is a car that Louis Chevrolet raced on board tracks, and so just a pretty car, and it was something, again, you see, very basic and a lot to handle. And in the bottom, you see the Frontenac's, which were the cars that the Chevrolets built. We talk about the Fronties and the Fronty Fords. We talk about them. In research, I found these Fronty cars were sometimes called Chevrolet cars, even though Chevrolet was no longer involved with General Motors, but so famous, they were recognized as such. And there had board track victories in these. And again, these were two-man cars that were done because that's the way the AAA had their ruling for that time. High speeds, 115, 120 miles an hour, as we see. 622 cubic inches. It's a big engine to produce just 58 horsepower, isn't it? Yeah. This is an interesting car. This is the racing car that Harry Miller ever built. It's called the Golden Submarine. He and Barney Oldfield built it, and the reason it was because Bob Berman, who we mentioned before, was their great friend, and Bob had a Peugeot, and Bob was racing in the Corona race in California in 1916, went off the track. He was killed. His riding mechanic was killed. Several other people were killed. There were serious injuries because it was a road race and something happened to the car. And road race, something happened to the car, you're standing a couple of feet away from the racing surface or the highway, because there just wasn't any thought to anything what happened in those periods. So they thought, how can we do something to protect the driver? And Harry Miller and Barney Oldfield put their heads together and they thought, well, if we build something that can enclose the driver and put something over the top, which we'd call today, and that's just what they did. As it points out here, this is the first racing car with a roll cage, and it's the first all-electrically welded steel frame automobile ever produced in this country. This was a gold car. That's why they called it the Golden Submarine. Harry Miller built an engine, four-cylinder engine. It was a two-man car, and you got in it and out the door. The exhaust pipe, however, from this design of the car went through the car between the driver and the passenger. And Barney Oldfield raced this car quite a bit. He did, however, flip into the infield lake at Lakewood Speedway in Atlanta, and that brought about picture number 2. He almost drowned in that thing, so they cut everything away but the front of the bodywork, and he's racing around in a vehicle that looks like that with some success. And after he quit racing that car in 1908, the engine still ran very well, and he liked the way that performed. He made this into the Oldfield Special, Roscoe Sarles, riding mechanic Waldo Stein, and this was the first car that was the Miller brand at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. This is Ralph De Palma, very famous, very popular, won thousands of races supposedly. Stephen's going to talk a little bit more about Ralph De Palma. How he could win 1,000 races, well, you figure he's a lot, he is, but he had races of 1 mile, 1 lap, because it was a challenge race. So you beat so-and-so, you won that race. That's how that happened. But anyway, he was an excellent racer. And this is an automobile that's a Packard, built on a Packard chassis. But it was built by Packard because they were interested in airplane engines prior to World War I, but they didn't want to go through the expense of testing the airplane engine in an airplane. So they tested it in a racing car. They made a 299 or 300 cubic inch V12, and they tested this engine for several years. And this is the engine that became the Liberty V12 engine in World War II, and it eventually powered the P-51, which was one of the outstanding airplanes of the Second World War. The other interesting thing about this particular car is we think, well, they didn't have the Indianapolis 500 during the World War I, and sometimes people say, well, there was no automobile racing during World War I. There actually was. There just was no national champion. There was no Indianapolis 500 because the 500 depended a lot on the European cars coming over. So they raced quite a bit during the World War I years, but while they were doing that, Ralph De Palma was actually a captain in the United States Army working on the development of this engine for airplane use. And Jesse Vincent was his manager at Packard. He was a colonel in this same unit in Wright Field in Ohio, working on the development of this engine during World War I, which became the World War II engine. So there was racing, and there was quite a lot of racing everywhere except Indianapolis. This is Lewis Chevrolet's business, the Frontenac Lewis and Arthur and Gaston Chevrolet were very famous automobile racers. This particular car is showing Gaston Chevrolet, and it's in his Monroe. The Monroe race cars were green. The Frontenac race cars were the exact same race cars, except they were red. So a Fronte and a Monroe were the same cars, just different colors. And Gaston Chevrolet was a very popular racer, very good racer, and we'll talk about him a little bit more. He was also posthumously 1920 AAA champion because he was killed in an accident at Beverly Hills Speedway, and we'll talk about that just a little bit. But you can see the board track, he's there. See the wider panels on the infield and the racing 2x4s which were put on their end is what the race cars raced on. The Frontenac cylinder heads were very popular on the Ford Model T. Compression improved the power, and also you can see the advertisement talking about the Fronte cylinder heads for other applications, Chevrolet, Whippets, things like that. These were, again, part of the large number of people making aftermarket products. Match racing was popular during the early board track eras. Here we have the Golden Submarine. We have the white De Palma car and the Chevrolet in the center. They toured as a group and went around, did match races together. This particular race, there were 3 races. Ralph De Palma won all 3. But look at all the people in the grandstands. This is, again, Sheepshead Bay in Brooklyn, New York. 1917. 40,000 spectators at this board track event. This was the main attraction. All right, we talked about not having races during the World War I years at Indianapolis, but they did at Cincinnati. This was, again, a 2-mile track, big track. And look at the grandstand. Look at the lineup of cars. They ran 5 abreast and paid a lot of money. And it was a thing that people were interested in doing even during the World War I time. Again, there's a advertisement for the race. Look at the pretty colors, the artwork. Look at the admission price, $1.50. Again, you talk about multiply that 10 or 15 times because the dollar was worth a lot more then than what its actual shows there. Okay. Again, here it says on the bottom about this, the Cincinnati track actually closed because of the exposure to the elements, but some of the wood was used to make a bar. That's what happened a lot of these tracks too. When they closed, they couldn't do anything anymore with the racetrack, but they would sell the wood to construction people, and they would use the wood to build houses and whatever needed to be done. July 4th, 1919, here is celebrating Eddie Rickenbacker. Eddie Rickenbacker, some of you may not or may know, was a very prominent automobile racer prior to his service in World War I. And I'm just going to read here just a little bit about Rickenbacker to give you an idea not only about Eddie, but the kind of success that people who were professional auto racers could have in these eras. Rickenbacker was from Columbus, Ohio. He was a young man whose father died when he was 12, so he had to quit school and go out and work. He got a lot of part-time jobs, a lot of jobs involving his hands. He became very interested in mechanical things and began taking correspondence courses in engineering. He would get a letter every so often, and here's this information he would do, is send it back and get another one. And so this is another way of education during this time when people couldn't go to school, but they wanted to improve themselves. In 1910, he was 19 years old. He had been working at the Firestone Columbus factory in Columbus, Ohio, that made automobiles. They were made one of the first left-hand automobiles in this country. He had been a riding mechanic in the Vanderbilt Cup races with Lee Frayer. He had been involved in this so much and had done so well that by 17 years old he was the shop foreman of the machine shop for the Firestone Columbus Company. But he wanted to do something better. He wanted to improve himself and go on and do other things. So they made him a salesman of Firestone Columbus cars, and he was given the Omaha territory. He was 19 years old at the time in 1910, and what this required was he would take people for rides in a Firestone Columbus, tell them how good it was and how powerful it was and how much this and that, and try and get them to buy it. And then he'd encourage them to come out to the races and see how the engine performed against other cars, because they had lots of races on fairgrounds tracks and city to city. Any place that had a race he would compete in this Firestone Columbus car that he turned into a four-cylinder racing car. And he did very well as a salesman, and he did very well as a racer. Raced at every race within 100 miles with Columbus with one of these cars that he developed. 1911, he was a relief driver in the first Indianapolis 500, drove 370 miles, and his car finished 13th in the race. Again, with Lee Frayer, they shared the ride. Then in 1912, again, he drove in the relief, but the company was nearly bankrupt, so he left the Columbus Buggy Company, and at the time, he wanted to be a professional racer. So he went and did that. The only problem was he had been barred by the AAA because he had been racing in a lot of unsanctioned races, and they didn't like that. The interesting thing was the contest board that barred him, he was the head of that contest board from 1927 to 1946. In late 1912, he went to Des Moines, Iowa, and began working for the Duesenberg brothers, who had located there as a $3 a day mechanic, and he was also their racing manager for the Mason Automobile Company. This is how they got their start involved in racing. But Masons worked well for the Duesenbergs and for Rickenbacker until the Mason Company decided they were going to get out of racing. Okay, so what do? Duesenbergs decide we're going to start our own company. They did this in 1914. They made Eddie the head of their racing division. They had 2 cars in the first Indianapolis 500. They performed well. Eddie won a lot of races, including a 300-mile race at the Sioux City track, which was a 2-mile dirt track, and it was one of the biggest races of the 1914 season. He won $10,000, which at the time was over $250,000 in our money, and this was actually what saved the Duesenbergs from going bankrupt. After the 1914 season, he went to the Maxwell team. He won many races with that, including several board track races. And Maxwell was getting out of racing, so he bought the racing cars from Maxwell with the help of Carl Fisher and Fred Allison, the Prestolite Company, and named them the Prestolite Specials. And with those cars, he won a lot of dirt races, and he won 3 major board track races during 1916, as well as racing and dirt and road races. And the board track races he won were at Sheepshead Bay, at Des Moines, and a 300-miler at Tacoma. This is where he was being honored, and that's the car that he won the Tacoma race in with a riding mechanic, because that was the rules of the time. And then his last win was at a 150-mile race at the Ascot Speedway in California, which at the time was a mile track. That was actually the end of Eddie Duesenberg's automobile racing career. He had 41 national championship races, 7 victories, and he also, in 1916, won $60,000 as an automobile racer. Today, that's about $1.5 million. So he was very successful. He joined the Air Force after that. First started as the driver for Blackjack Pershing, then got into the air service, wanted to start an air division with former racing drivers, but they, for some reason, didn't want to do that. But he became the ace of aces, 26 victories. That's one of the aircraft, the Scout, the SPAD that he used. And then later in the 1930s, he was awarded the Medal of Honor for his service during World War I. But here on this particular day, they're honoring Eddie Rickenbacker. Notice the other names: Louis Chevrolet, Dario Aresta, Eddie Hearn, Cliff Durant, Ralph Mumford. These were all major sports personalities in the automobile racing. Here's Harry Hartz and Harlan Fengler. Harlan Fengler, of course, for years was very involved in the Indianapolis 500. Harry Hartz was 1926 champion, an exceptional board track racer. This is a 1922 Duesenberg that raced in the 1921 French Grand Prix. That was the first French Grand Prix after World War I. Just keep saying that. And you see the number on the tail. The laws at the time required any vehicle on the roads in France to have a number. That was what that is. 1924 Duesenberg was the first American supercharged race car, just to see how it's developed over the years. And again, we talk about board track racers. These are two ads from the 1920s, and these people were equal to Bobby Jones, equal to Jack Dempsey, equal to Babe Ruth as far as being stars. Notice the picture in the center, Fred Wagner. He was the official starter for all the board track races. He was the official starter for all the AAA races, and we'll talk about him in a little bit, but he was as well known as the people who were the racing and the people and the racetracks where they raced. Here is a late 1920s ad. Again, the Duesenbergs were interested in selling automobiles. They used racing to do that. And here's an ad showing all the various ways that the Duesenberg was an outstanding vehicle for its chassis, its driveline, and its engine, because that's what they were selling the people. How would you let your people know about it? Well, that left panel there shows the handouts that were given. And it's the Atlantic City Speedway, Atlantic City Motor Speedway, their first race. And there's a guarantee in the top left that says these races aren't fixed. This isn't hippodrome. Because in the early years of automobile racing, especially the International Motor Contest Association, these would go around the tracks and they would have races and they would promote this driver, let's see if he can win here, and there's the battle between this driver and that driver. Well, these were all races that were already picked, and they were just the excitement of seeing something on the racetrack. But they guaranteed you that these were races that were true races, national and international speed kings. And these were handouts. All the tracks had these particular things. Also, the media was very interested in automobile racing. You can look through and see some of these things, like this magazine. Look at the artwork on the front of the board track there. This was something that attracted people's attention. The newsreels, you can go on the internet and see newsreels of board track racing because they were to photograph, there were excitement, there were speed. Also, entertainment used board track racing. One of the early movies that Charlie Chaplin made was of an automobile race. Why? A lot of people there. It was in the daytime because that's how they filmed things. They didn't have studio work. They had to be out where there was bright sun. So they used automobile racing as something that people were interested in. The Roaring '20s was a great time for automobile racing. Here's some modern mechanics and inventions. We probably know that as Mechanics Illustrated. This is the beginning of Mechanics Illustrated. This particular man, Ray Kuntz, was an automotive engineer and is identified as an authority on automobile racing. He's encouraging young men to become automobile racers. He's telling them how much money they can make, how easy it is to convert a Model A or a Model T into a racing car. He even in this article tells you some of the parts that you need, how much they cost, how easy it is to build. Now, how many of us wanted to be racers when we were kids? How many of us had our parents say, yeah, Herbie, go ahead? I don't think too many. But that's what it was in the 20s. The far left, you see, here's a pamphlet that Arthur Chevrolet offered for $2. Or if you brought a Fonty head, you got it for free. It was an 8-page pamphlet with no photographs in it, but it told you directly and entirely how to convert a Ford Model T into a winning race car, what you needed, how long it had to be. The first thing was to take the chassis. It had a 100-inch wheelbase. The first thing he said was, you make that 88. And it told that, and it was very popular. Here's another example of advertisement. You can buy, like you can today, you can go to anyone, buy a modified stock car for parts, put them together like a giant model kit. Here you could build a racing car out of a Ford that was good on dirt tracks, brick, or board tracks. $750 for a complete frame. That would be about $10,000 today. This will give you an idea of the cost of these things. And this tell you a little interesting story. I wanted to say how we're going to relate this to what's today. I looked up, well, let's say 1925. That would be a good year because of a couple of things. Let me see what the average income was in 1925. So I typed in the computer, average income 1925. Popped up, $14.40 it would be today. Comparative was $3,078.27. Good, now we're going to have to compare it to today. So I figured, let me try, see average income 2018, figure give the whole year. Boy, that was a chore. No matter what site, government site I went on, they talked about average income for people that were particular age, average income for people in the Northeast, average income for people in the particular state. I'm sure if I looked hard enough, it would have average income for people who are blonde, left-handed, and wear green shoes. It was just that difficult. The average income today for all of us, somewhere between $50,000 and $52,000 according to the Department of Labor, U.S. Department of Labor. That was at the bottom. But look at the prices. Pound of bacon, 47 cents. That would be $6.70 today. And you can see down the side. Postage stamp, 2 cents. The only thing that's interesting about all of these is you see a gallon of gasoline in 1925 cost $2.88. In town, they're selling, what was it, $2.69? So we're doing better now gasoline-wise than we were in 1925. But you see here, 1925, that was the first year for the front-wheel drive Miller, and the front-wheel drive Miller cost $15,000 in 1925. That's $216,000. Over here, Ralph De Palma, $10,000. That's $144,000. These prices did not change from the time they were first made until the time they were ended. They all stayed $15,000 or $10,000, which I thought was very interesting. And in 1925, if you wanted to buy a Model T, it only cost you $260. So you can see there was a wide difference in the cost, like there is now, of racing cars. And a Miller engine, if you blew your engine, $5,000, which is $72,000 in today. So that gives you a little idea of what the money values on these things are. Here is the Miller specifications. I would point out that the fuel tank came in the Miller 25 gallons, but for longer races they would put in up to 40 gallons. There was even one racer, and I forget who it was, who had a round tank like a giant basketball, so all the fuel would go down. There wouldn't be anything laying around. but you see the workmanship. These are just beautiful cars. This is what got me interested in these cars. I saw Millers, I saw pictures of Millers, and I just thought they were beautiful. Notice the engine size, 1920 to 22, was 183 cubic inches, or 3 liters. That was when the AAA contest board decided to change the engines because they were going to be the same as the international limit on engines due to the French Grand Prix. That's how come it's 3-liter engine there. And then they went down, and so like that. The bottom is a engine tag. It gives the firing order of the engine that Harry Miller developed. These, again, all hand-built, just beautiful racing cars. Notice the tire sizes, too, and that. Here's Jimmy Murphy, who was an outstanding board track racer, king of the boards. He is the person who decided that it might be an idea to try a front-wheel drive car to pull the car through the corner rather than push it through. He thought it would be engineering-wise a better thing. And he had Harry Miller build one of these things. Unfortunately, Jimmy Murphy never got to drive that car. He was killed at Syracuse in an accident going for the lead. And that was in 1924. So he never got to drive this car. But this car appeared for the first time in the 1925 Indianapolis 500 and finished second. It was driven by Dave Lewis. And in fact, I'm sorry, I should have showed you that. That's the very first Miller front-wheel drive car, and that's the Dave Lewis driving the car. They were very popular, very fast. The interesting thing about the Miller, as though it was a good idea with the front-wheel drive, the Miller front-wheel and rear-wheel drive car won about the same amount of board track races. And it was only a car that the front-wheel drive car was only a car that raced at Indianapolis and the board tracks. It did not race on the dirt tracks at all. Just beautiful race cars. Tires were important. 9-10 years of board track racing, they used regular street tires. Whatever was on the car was what they used, and of course they caused problems. Gum dipping was a procedure to keep the heat away from the tire, but they were street tires, and as wide as your hand. They weren't very big at all, and they were inflated to 50 pounds. This was a hard tire. Then in the 20s, they started making dedicated racing tires because they understood the problems they were having. At Indianapolis 500, you'd maybe go 10 or 15 laps in these tires and have to change them. They needed things better. So that's why they had the dedicated racing tires. And they started to balance tires. Sid Hugdahl was the first racer who balanced tires to get better wear out of them. This, again, was in the 1920s. In 1925, Firestone introduced for the highway the balloon tire. Better traction, better handling. It was cooler. Did all the things it wanted to do, and they developed from that. The Firestone gum dip balloon racing tire was introduced in 1925. It won with Peter DiPaolo. Bigger cross section, contact patch was bigger. On dirt tracks and at Indianapolis, 35 pounds. On board tracks, 65 to 75. The high speeds and the high G-forces in the turns, they needed something to stabilize the cars a little bit better, get a little more speed out of them. And wire wheels, and so board tracks, they ran with a toe-in of 1/8 to 3-inch because the high speeds would open the wheels up. On the lower size tracks, on the dirt tracks, they would run with a toe out because the speeds would push the tires in. So that was just a little bit of difference there. Also, the reason I used the Oldfield tire was Barney Oldfield, when he retired from racing, became the Firestone manager of racing. And the 1920, 21, and 22 Indianapolis 500s you may see in historical ads are credited to being won by Firestone. which is true because Firestone made the Oldfield tire, and the cars that Tommy Milton, Gaston Chevrolet, and Jimmy Murphy rode in those Indianapolis 500 wins are all Oldfield tires, and if you look closely at the pictures in the winner's circle, you can see it says Oldfield tires on their race cars. So the first 3 years of Firestone's wins in that long series were on Oldfield tires. Here's an interesting track. This is the one in Miami, Florida. It's the 1.25 mile, Fulford Miami Speedway. Carl G. Fisher was developing Miami. He also had a board track down there. His general manager was Ray Haroon, and the track ran one race. Here's the race. It's being won by Peter DiPaolo in the Duesenberg and Harry Hartz in the Miller. Not long after this race on February 22nd, the great hurricane in September of 1926 came through, and that's a picture of the racetrack after the hurricane came through. Just absolutely destroyed it. There was nothing that was left of it. All that wood was used to rebuild the Miami area. Board track events, here we talked about some of this, varied length, varied match races, things like that, things to get people to come to the races. There was one 500-mile race, and the lineups were, as we said, they were mostly cars that were developed by the manufacturers. 1920 to 1931, this is when it became more of a dedicated racing series. All of the national championship races were on board tracks. There was still other kind of racing, but they were mostly Millers and Duesenbergs, and the Franti Fords and the Frontenac's were 1920 to 1924 because those engines did not ever have a supercharger on them. The other interesting thing about the 20s to 1931, prior to this, or mostly during this time, numbers were assigned to cars the day before the race based on the decision of the contest board or how the car was entered into the race. 1924, that was the first year they assigned numbers based on how you did the year before. So if you see a 1925 picture with number 1, that car was the winner of the championship in 1924. Here again, here's an official program showing Barney Oldfield and Lewis Chevrolet. Special race. There's the Los Angeles Speedway. That was the Los Angeles Speedway was the Beverly Hills Speedway, but that was also known as Los Angeles Speedway. Reason I put this on here, 1928 State Fair. This was the year that board track racing was really on the way down. So the AAA contest board decided that dirt again be brought into the fold as far as national championship races. And that's how this became the first national championship dirt race in a long time at the state fairgrounds. Stock car races were special things. They see the number 1 and the 2. They are actually cars that could have been driven to the track because stock car racing was just what it said. Stock car racing. Notice the spare tire, the windshields, the headlights. That's what they raced. They were specialty races. Also, motorcycles ran on the board tracks, and I say those people just did things differently, a lot of accidents and so, but they used them. The bottom picture is what is considered by historians as the first real stock car in the fact of a racing stock car. In 1933, the AAA sanctioned its first road race, which was the Elgin Road Race in Illinois, and Fred Frame won with this car. Notice there are no fenders, no windshield, no spare tire. There was a little bit of work that could be done. So this is the first, what they consider the first stock car to be built. And this car is currently owned by Dana Meekum of the Meekum Auto Auctions. Louis Meyer. In 1985, I had the opportunity to write a story about him and spoke to him for over an hour about automobile racing. Wonderful man. Everyone I've talked to who's known him, and I've talked to several people, said he was a gentleman, and that's how he treated me. He won 3 board track races. He started as a mechanic and then went into a driver and stuff like that, then became a Indianapolis 500 winner and champion. He had the Meyer-Drake engines for a while, then he had the Ford racing engines. And this is his 1928 Miller that won the Altoona 200. And talked to him about a lot of things. And when he said he wanted to be a board track driver, Pop Wagner said to him, okay, you get out on the track, but if you pass anybody, I'm going to flag you in. There was no other way to learn how to drive, so you had to drive around the back to learn. And he became very adept at it. And I asked him, well, who are some good board track drivers? And you see Jimmy Murphy, Harry Hartz, Leon DeRay, and a lot of them, he said. But Frank Lockhart, he said, was just very good. And Frank Lockhart was maybe one of the best race drivers and engineering people that we ever dealt with. This car is, we'll talk about this in a moment, but this car that he's in now was the car that Frank Lockhart set a world record in that stood for 30 years. This is Fred Wagner. He was the starter for all the board track races. He was the official starter for the AAA for over 20 years. And he started out to be a runner. Then he was a racer. And then he started flagging, getting involved with that. He's interesting that he holds the checkered flag. He's the first person to ever be photographed with a checkered flag ending a race. And it was in the 1906 Vanderbilt Cup races. He also not only was the starter, he was the man who checked the track for security and safety. He was the man who got all the money before the races started. He was the man who assigned positions. He was the man who would call fouls because they had no communication. Something happened on the track, he was it. He was the man at the end of the race who would tell you where you're going to pick up your train to take your trip to the next race. He would get housing for the people. And in his spare time, he wrote a nationally syndicated column on automobile racing. But the most interesting thing about all his involvement with automobile racing, he didn't know how to drive an automobile. Here are the signals that he would wave. And through 1929, this was about standard. Red. Here's the official thing from the AAA handbook. That meant the course was clear. That's how they started the race. Yellow, the course was blocked, you're slow. Green, you are entering your last lap. White, stop for consulting in the pits. And the checkered flag, you are finished. They changed it in 1930, the AAA contest board, because they wanted to be a little more current with what was going on with driver. That's when the traffic signal said red stop, yellow caution, green go. So they changed those signals to that. Although notice the white still meant stop and the black was added, which means you were entering your last lap. That was in 1930. That again was changed in 1937 for the white meaning you're entering your last lap, and the black flag meant that you were stopped. And since 1937, that's been basically the American racing flags. Here's a map that shows where the tracks were during their lifetime. And it was interesting that Louis Meyer told me he and his wife would travel from Los Angeles, where he lived, to Indianapolis, because that was the center location for all the racing. But he only covered about 100 paved miles during that entire trip. Everything else was gravel or something worse. And you'd stay at a farmer's house for $1.50, get big breakfast, and they'd send you on your way. Racing, you would stay at a buddy's house if you were at a racetrack. And so all the cars were shipped by rail. Atlantic City was interesting because they had two rail lines into Atlantic City, because during World War I, the location of the Atlantic City track was a ammunition loading plant, and they loaded 9 million rounds of ammunition in 5 years, an explosion, which was just fantastic. But he said, as he said, what they did, they thought they were natural. Here's how cars got to the racetrack. This is a 1917 Hudson. This was a dark blue car, by the way, and that's where they went. And this also made it possible for races to be announced at major locations. They came on railroad cars. When they got to the station, they put some of these and leave them out so the people would know there's a race in town. The bottom is Umbrella Mike Boyle, who was a Indianapolis car owner. He was the head of the Chicago Electrical Union, and they used the Diamond T truck to get it from the railroad station to the track. Mike Boyle was an interesting guy. They called him Umbrella Mike because he always walked around with an umbrella. It was located at the top, it was okay, but the panels were open. And Mike would go in a bar and he'd talk to people and they'd come by and they'd drop a little something into the umbrella. And Mike had connections in Chicago in 1920s. If you needed something done, you saw Mike. A couple interesting people here. This is William Shattuck, who was a pulmonary physician, an actual MD, who became a race driver because he enjoyed working with the people when he was a physician at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. And he bought a car and he raced in 35 events. Never won one, but he was competitive. He was a relief driver at Indianapolis. And he just had some fun doing it. And the bottom, you've probably heard, a lot of you, I'm sure, of Leon Duray, whose actual name was George Stewart, but when he was racing with the International Motor Contest Association, he wanted to be the dashing Frenchman. So he would dress in black and his hair combed back. And this worked fine until the French attaché in New Orleans wanted to meet the great French driver, and Leon didn't speak any French. But he was very fast, and he was early working with alcohol fuels because the engines were supercharged and needed them so much, needed the power, and also with supercharged engines. He eventually became a car owner at Indianapolis, but he also went in 1929 with that front-wheel drive car, set many records in Europe, and also raced in the Italian Grand Prix in Monza. Here, just briefly, is the Atlantic City proposal to build the track. You can see how much they were expecting to make, and so the cost, the lumber, they actually used over 5 million board feet of wood. This was about a $6 million job in today's money. And the people who ran this were, again, this is what happened with the board track. They were investors of wealth, rich sportsmen. They were business tycoons and so. Here's the Atlantic City track. This is opening day. Far picture on the left is 1926. This is a rather recent overhead picture of the track. Because this was an ammunition dump and all the chemicals and stuff, they used it when the property was no longer used. The state of New Jersey allowed it to just grow up. It's now a wildlife area. Terry and I were there a couple of years ago. It's one of the few former sites that has nothing on it. There is not even a marker to indicate the history of that track, which had the ammunition dump or the racetrack. But that's the way things are. But these cars, and again, you see the wood and so. Here's Harry Hartz, who won the race, the first race, nonstop 300 miles. He won $12,000 then. That'd be $171,000 today. Just amazing what This is the official report. Notice they have the tires, when the tires were changed, right rear, left rear, things like that. That's a sign to get into the infield and stuff. Here, this record that Harry Hart set in that first victory of his lasted for over 30 years. He went 135 miles an hour for his 300-mile race. No one in America ran a faster race until Sam Hanks won the Indianapolis 500 in 1957. Harry was the national champion in 1926. He was in a bad crash, spent 2 years in a hospital, walked around the rest of his life with a cane, but he was very involved in the Speedway and the technical committee. 1927, Frank Lockhart set a world record that also stood for over 30 years. It went 147 miles an hour around, 0.729 miles an hour around Atlantic City track. This is a picture of him on the track setting that speed record. This is a qualifying record that was not broken for over 30 years. Leon DeRay in a front-wheel drive Miller at the Packard test track went in 1928 148 miles an hour, but that wasn't a qualifying record, so it was, apples and oranges. Notice he has a air intake in front of the cowl. This is the engine he did it with. This was an invention that he made with a couple other engineers. This was the intercooler. When the air came into the supercharger while it was being supercharged, the air-fuel mixture was over 300 degrees. Going through this intercooler before it got into the engine lowered the temperature by 200 degrees. It went from 300 to 100, and this made all the difference. He said this was an oil cooler, so people wouldn't know what it was. Leon DeRay was the next one to make one different, used it on the front-wheel drive Miller. But the U-shape, it was a 5-piece unit, and they used gasoline and Benzoil to help power it a little bit more because the compression was so great on these engines anymore. They needed more than they could get. The first 100-octane fuel wasn't until 1934 when Jimmy Doolittle with Shell Oil Company made the first aviation fuel at that level. Here again is the report of that race. The yellow eye outline, this tells about the speed record that he set. At the bottom, it shows his speed, 147.729. Cliff Woodbury was second fastest that day. He was almost 4 miles an hour slower. Here's the tires that they used. Notice the pressures were very high, the sizes. And at each race, they identified the tire that was being used by serial number. This was part of the official records, and they show what happened and how people went out of the race, something broke, someone ran out of gas, nonstop, things like that. There's more of that. Atlantic City Speedway was also known as Speedway, New Jersey. That was in the official records. They wanted to do that and promote it because although it was listed as Hamilton, it was actually in a township, and they wanted to make something else like Indianapolis, which is actually in Speedway, Indiana. And sometimes it was called Amatol because of the ammunition plant, too. Here, when Lockhart set that record, the speed at Indianapolis was 113 miles an hour. Tony Bentenhauser was the man who broke Lockhart's qualifying record, 176.830 at Monza when they had the race at Two Worlds. Then George Amick broke what was then the American record at Daytona. He unfortunately was killed in that special 100-lap race. It was the only Indianapolis car race at Daytona. And then the first time that someone went faster than Frank Lockhart at Indianapolis was when Jim Hurtubise went 149 miles an hour in 1960. The last board track winner was Shorty Catlin. That's the car he raced, and that was at Altoona. Altoona was the longest living board track. It was there for longer than any others. Woodbridge was one of the small half-mile tracks. That was the last winner, was Bert Carnance. That's the car he raced in. That's the Woodbridge track at the bottom. That is the site of the Woodbridge High School football stadium. So that was one of the ones that lasted through. And here are your top board track winners. Murphy, Milton, you see the names here, all names that you remember. And thought I'd highlight Tommy Milton for a minute because of his 50 board track wins, land speed records, Indianapolis, all the things he did. He was 100% blind in his right eye and had limited vision in his left. And there he is in the Miller. Here, Gaston Chevrolet, when he was killed, this was a major, major event. This was a dangerous sport. There's no question about it. They're going so fast and what they're going in and how they're doing. Eddie O'Donnell and he crashed. One driver was thrown, one of the mechanics was thrown out of the racetrack. The color panel shows this, and the reason this color panel was drawn was because Gaston Chevrolet actually believed. He called his brother Louis and told him, I'm going to die here. And Louis said, no, you've been successful at that track. You're going to retire. Race one more race, you're going to be the national champion. And that was it. You see, that's the protection they had. Here is the national story that went out about this. It's very graphic, but that was 1920s writing. Here is a picture of Eddie Rickenbacker. Notice the football helmet. That's a picture taken in 1914. He was maybe the first to wear head protection other than the flight helmets that they wore because they had nothing else. Helmet, goggles, and gloves. That was all the protection they had. Here, unfortunately, a list of the people who were killed in board track races. The names at the bottom. That's the driver that was killed. Just was a different time. These were different people. Factors that influenced the board track. The automobile industry, as we talked about, it was developing the car, the high speed. Major business people. Firestone family invested in board tracks. The Ford family invested in board tracks. Thomas Edison invested in a board track. So did Louis B. Mayer, rather, because the Culver City track was built right up against the back lot of the MGM studios. Automobile racing, a major sport, communities wanted to have it, increase the value of the community and get people to help the economy, and these people were major racers. What the cause of the demise? It cost a lot to maintain something that wasn't protected by anything for the weather. Plus the recertification. It may cost $100,000 to put new wood down when they needed it. Lack of competition. Louis Meyer told me the fastest car always won. There was no way to, because it was just speed, there was no way for a slower car to get around the faster car. Weather damage, dwindling attendance because people, we saw that. It's not continuing to be. And then, of course, the Great Depression. Here's a picture, a postcard rather, of the Charlotte Speedway. Interestingly, they had 2 or 3 stock car races there that didn't draw any attention at all. Now you go to Charlotte, and that's all they have. After the board tracks, there was nothing till the Nutley Velodrome and some other places raced midgets on these tracks. You couldn't get a championship car on that. They were too small. Seventh of a mile, you have 4 or 5 championship cars on there. They'd be nose to tail. But the Velodrome ran for a couple of years, very successful, but also they had 3 fatalities. The New York newspapers just were out against this kind of thing. That's Tommy Heinerschitz leading this group of people. And you figure 7th mile track, they're going around 7-8 seconds, 70 miles an hour. That's really doing something. And that's Henry Banks at the top, who became director of competition. This is in Chicago. They built a board track for one use. Cost $25,000 then, almost $500,000 today. This was for the World Championship, and had 90,000 people see this race, and it was for one race. This was at the Polo Grounds. This was a high bank board track at the Polo Grounds. It was supposed to be run for several weeks, but every time they had a race, it rained except for 2 times. And what they used to make this board track was this. It was a portable board track. This was an article in 1948, Popular Mechanics, about this board track. Someone got the idea we can have automobile racing all over the country wherever you want it. One of these, plop it down, have your race, move on. You see what it was. The promoter was a millionaire sportsman. They had people who were involved, National Midget. The designers, Leon and Lionel Levy, were architects who developed horse racing tracks, boxing arenas in baseball and football stadiums, things like that. 1/5 mile, all of this with a steel underpinning. It was like putting a big model kit together. You transported it from place to place. Cost $150,000 then just for this, $1.5 million today, but the transportation and the labor was extra. They ran it a couple times in the Polo Grounds, then it was shipped out to the Rose Bowl. Rose Bowl and Los Angeles had board track midget racing. The problem was the tracks were too narrow, no activity, no action, and they tried, because they had dirt midget racing at these 2 venues, they tried this to think it would be better. It wasn't, and that was sort of the end of board track racing. And I'll end with this. Here are 2 interesting books. Both are still available, although they're not new books, they're used books or something like that, although the Wall Smacker, which is Peter DiPaolo's autobiography, you can get in an e-book. Tells all about the board track era. And Track Guts and Glory that Dick Wallen produced in 1990. I wrote 2 chapters in that book. I would have written it differently today than I did then, because of the internet you can find out so much more information than going to the libraries like I did. Plus there are other books. Griff Borgenson has the book about the golden era of auto racing in the 1920s, and Mark Dees' excellent book on the Millers. These give you some insight into board track racing. And that, ladies and gentlemen, I hope I've piqued your interest anyway, and I'm just proud to be able to address this group. And board track racing is something that happened a long time ago, but it's a major part of American history, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you. I guess we have time for any questions anyone has. Yes, sir. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I forgot we're on.
Okay, let's do this again. The board tracks with a 30-degree bank turns are higher, and they were 1.5 mile, 2 mile tracks. The G-forces on the suspension systems and the wheels in particular must have been tremendous. What was the attrition rate at these races that were 200 miles?
Not really that much. A flat tire was the thing that was going to get a lot of these people to come in to have to change tires. They didn't have, interestingly enough, that many cars break down mechanically in that way. An engine might go bad or something like this. But I asked Louis Meyer what they used. He said we used the exact same car we used at Indianapolis or on the dirt track. They didn't make any other provisions for these racetracks, and they all ran wire wheels.
Associated question real quick. The drivers also experienced these G-forces, and their seats, they weren't really constrained like we have drivers today in those seats. How did they hold up to this?
They were different kinds of people because they didn't have relief drivers generally, and they got out, and you see pictures, they were just worn out. It was something. I think the speed, though, going around that fast gave them a little less of the strain on the straightaways. They could relax a little bit. I found no instances of anyone being overcome and dying because of that. Like sometimes at Indianapolis, had a couple of drivers die after the race because of excessive heat and things like that. Yeah. Anyone else? Well, that's fine. Yes, thank you again. We've certainly enjoyed our presentation, and I'm looking forward to what Stephen has to say. Thank you.